Hey there, Trailblazers! So, today we finally got the version 3 beta changes for MORTENAX Blade. And honestly, I think a lot of people in the community are probably feeling pretty relieved right now. Because after how insanely strong his early beta versions looked, many players were expecting Hoyoverse to absolutely destroy this character in V3 with massive nerfs across the board. But surprisingly, that really didn't happen. In fact, depending on the type of player you are, some of these changes may actually make him feel even better to play overall. So today, we're going to go over all of the major V3 adjustments, what they actually mean for his gameplay, how they affect his teams, and whether this changes his pull value going into version 4.3. And trust me, there are definitely some pretty important things to talk about here. So starting off with probably the biggest quality of life changes in the entire update, we have the reductions to his HP consumption. Now, as many of you guys already know, MORTENAX Blade's entire kit revolves around sacrificing his own HP in exchange for massive damage and powering up his transformation state. That high-risk playstyle is basically the core identity of the character. But one of the biggest complaints during earlier beta versions was that he honestly felt a little too dangerous to play sometimes. Like, yes, the damage was absurd. But in longer fights, especially at E0, there were moments where it felt like the character was genuinely trying to kill himself faster than your sustain unit could keep up. Well, now that issue has been toned down quite a bit, because his skill HP consumption has now been reduced from 15% down to 10%, while his ultimate HP consumption also dropped from 30% down to 20%. And honestly, these are very noticeable changes. He still burns HP constantly. He still has that aggressive, living on the edge blade playstyle. But now it feels far less punishing and way more manageable for the average player, especially for people who don't plan on heavily investing into Eidolons. And speaking of survivability, Trace 1 also received a massive buff, because it now grants 50% damage reduction alongside a 50% incoming healing bonus, which is honestly kind of insane. When you combine this together with a lower HP drain, MORTENAX Blade suddenly becomes dramatically safer than before. Like, genuinely, this change alone probably fixes one of his biggest weaknesses from the earlier beta versions. Before V3, some players were worried that he might end up being too uncomfortable or too risky outside of extremely optimized setups. But now, he looks way more stable at baseline. And I think that's a huge win for the character overall. Now, moving on to what is probably the most controversial part of the V3 changes, we need to talk about Trace 2. Because this passive got completely redesigned. Previously, he provided a team-wide follow-up attack buff, which made him feel incredibly flexible in a lot of different team archetypes. But now, that buff has been removed entirely. Instead, if MORTENAX Blade is the only Nihility character on the team, he gains a massive 75% personal damage increase. At the same time, his ultimate damage buff was also increased from 50% up to 75%. So overall, what Hoyoverse seems to be doing here is pushing him away from being this universal follow-up support hybrid, and instead making him more focused as either a dedicated hypercarry or a specialized support for ultimate-oriented teams. Which honestly makes a lot of sense, because before these changes, he was starting to look a little too flexible, like he was fitting into almost everything. But now, there's a much clearer direction for how they want the character to function. And one of the biggest winners from this change is definitely going to be Acheron teams, because the stronger ultimate amplification synergizes extremely well there. At the same time though, players who wanted him mainly as a universal FUA support may be slightly disappointed. So this is definitely one of those situations where the changes are both a buff and a nerf depending on what kind of teams you plan to run. Now, another huge adjustment happened to his E2, because his Eidolon 2 was completely reworked. Now ally ultimate damage can count as follow-up attack damage, and all allies gain 75% follow-up damage, which honestly opens up some very crazy possibilities for dedicated follow-up compositions. This is the kind of change that could create some extremely powerful synergy interactions later down the line as more characters release. But at the same time, it also makes his E2 more specialized rather than universally powerful. So again, we're seeing the exact same pattern here. Hoyoverse is clearly trying to narrow his role and define his strongest archetypes more clearly. Now on top of all that, his signature light cone also got adjusted. Its base HP was increased from 1270 to 1375. The max HP bonus increased from 24% to 30%. But the base ATK got lowered slightly. And honestly, this is basically just a buff, because MORTENAX blade scales primarily with HP anyway. So losing a bit of ATK really doesn't matter much compared to gaining even more HP scaling, which again reinforces the entire identity of the character. He is very clearly being designed as an HP-focused damage dealer first and foremost. And finally, we also got improvements to his new relic set, because now it buffs skill damage alongside ultimate damage. And probably even more importantly, the effect activates immediately at the start of battle instead of requiring setup beforehand, which just makes the set feel dramatically smoother and more practical overall. So when you look at everything together, I honestly think V3 ended up being a net positive for MORTENAX Blade. The survivability issues got massively improved. His gameplay looks much smoother and less frustrating. His role identity is now way clearer. And despite some of the team utility nerfs, he still looks extremely strong in the compositions he's specifically designed for. Now obviously, this is still beta. V4 changes can absolutely happen, and Hoyoverse could still tweak numbers again before release. But compared to what many players feared going into V3, this could have gone way worse. Right now, the general community reaction honestly seems more relieved than anything else. People were expecting him to get completely gutted. Instead, he came out looking safer, cleaner, and still incredibly powerful. Especially for Acheron teams, solo nihility hypercarry setups, and dedicated ultimate-focused compositions. So yeah, MORTENAX Blade is definitely still looking like one of the biggest characters to keep an eye on heading into version 4.3. So that's pretty much all of the current changes to MORTENAX Blade's kit. If you found the info in this video helpful, feel free to give it a like. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all the latest honkaistarrail news and leaks. That's it for now, so I'll see you in the next video.